Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another book review from the HorrorLand book series, and it's book number 1, Revenge of the Living Dummy. Oh boy, this book. Off the bat, I heard, some mixed things about this book over the years. When I first got into recollecting and getting myself acquainted with the Goosebumps IP back in 2020, this book was something on high interest to read. And I've been putting it off for so long because I've heard mixed things about it, to be honest. And I was waiting for the right time to do it. And since I'm reading through these dummy books, I thought it'd be fun to just do it now. Now, mind you, for this review, I'm only covering the main story, which are, in this book, it's only 93 pages. And there is a secondary element which ties into this overarching story within the first 10 books of HorrorLand called Enter HorrorLand. And I'll be doing that, Enter HorrorLand side stories, for the first 10 books in its own review at some point. So if you want to hear my thoughts on that, you're going to have to wait for that video. So I'm only covering the 93-page main story here. And I've seen all over the place opinions about this book. Some people out there say that this is one of the worst Goosebumps books ever made. Some people say it's one of the weaker Slappy books out there in the bunch. And then on the other side of the spectrum, this is some people's personal favorites, or some of their personal favorites of the Slappy series. His little mini-series, his little franchise within the Goosebumps IP. For people say this is their favorite HorrorLand book. And I'm just scratching my head, y'all, for the fans of this book. And I'm not trying to be mean or crap on anybody's feelings if you like this book, but this book has to be one of the most poorly paced, all over the place books I've read in Goosebumps, period. And in a lot of ways, I kind of question if Stein actually wrote this. This feels like jumbled fan fiction or a scrap TV show script that never made it into the TV show back in the day. And it boggles my mind. For this being the first book that Stein made for the Goosebumps IP since the cancellation of Series 2000. And some people might say that the series lived on with the novellas that came out around the cancellation of Series 2000 and The Nightmare Room as well. And in a lot of ways, the Haunting Hour TV show was kind of like a spiritual successor of the 90s TV show. But HorrorLand coming back, and after reading a few of these books, these first 10, I have to say, this one is so far the one that shows the most growing pains. I mean, I really can't recommend this book. And I'm getting kind of ahead of myself because I want to save a lot when I want to unpack for the review portion. But if you haven't read this and you're a Slappy fan, I guess you should try it. But if you're not a Slappy fan, you can honestly skip this book. I'm not lying, y'all. It boggles my mind how this book is still in print. I guess it was the first modern, and this very well could be the most printed modern Goosebumps book, because it's still in bookstores, still at Barnes & Noble, Books A Million. They're still selling copies of it. Good for them, and good for this book here. But I'm just not a fan. I'm not a fan of this. Just know that before I get into the review. Okay. So let's get into the plot overview of this story without giving too much away. So the story starts off with this foreshadowing event, which kind of feels random, but it's this girl named Brittany. She's the main character. She's a 12-year-old girl. And she's out in the graveyard with her friend Molly. And there's this storm going on, and you don't really know what's going on, but they're in this graveyard. And they're trying to bury something, and there's a tombstone that is starting to collapse down on top of Brittany. And there's a hand that reaches out from behind it that grabs her ankle. And the paragraph cliffhangs. And then the second paragraph picks up where that left off, and it jumps 2 weeks prior to the events of the first chapter. And it sets up this backstory with Brittany having her cousin Ethan, who is this kid who's described in the story to be kind of from a broken home. His parents are divorced, kind of going through a rough patch in their marriage. So they've shipped Ethan off to live with Brittany and her parents for an undisclosed amount of time. And Brittany's parents are, or especially her mom, is pressuring Brittany to be friends with Ethan, but Brittany, kind of reminiscent to Trina and Dan from Night of the Living Dummy 3, getting into some rehashed territory, has some bad blood with Ethan from the past. And she recollects in her monologue about Ethan, about how he's kind of a prick, how just because he's in a broken home doesn't mean he's a good kid. He's tried pulling pranks on her in the past, and they really just don't get along. They're just two polarized types of people. When you put them together, they just repel. But since the situation is inevitable, Brittany kind of has to be forced to hang out with Ethan. Well, Ethan, of course, arrives, and Brittany really wants to go to her friend Molly's house. And Molly's this friend of hers that has a father who's into this collecting hobby of his. He's kind of into some macabre, right? And Ethan gets to tag along, but Ethan has brought with him this creepy dummy that he calls Mr. Bad Boy. And throughout the book, Ethan presumably is making Mr. Bad Boy his dummy, who is described to look like, from what we know in the past, to be Slappy. To say, I'm a bad boy. I'm really a bad boy. And he just says that repeatedly throughout the book. But we'll get into that later. And Ethan seems kind of like a weird kid, but, Brittany's kind of giving you the backstory already of how crappy Ethan kind of is. And you get to learn how crappy Ethan actually is throughout the book. But anyway, they go to Molly's house, and Molly's dad invites them in and is glad to meet Ethan. And Ethan's curious about, some things he might have heard about Molly's dad. And Molly wants to show Ethan this new thing that her father has brought home for his collection. So Brittany also hasn't seen this item yet, so they head up to this attic in their house where the father has collected, some weird macabre stuff from around the world. And there's this doll that has like a green shrunken head, similar to How I Got My Shrunken Head, but has like a body made of like, I don't know, it's like a fake body, but an actual real shrunken head that used to belong to a human. And it's in this glass case, and the father's given the backstory about this doll called the Mind Stealer doll. And this Mind Stealer doll may or may not have the ability to steal the minds of people. And he doesn't really know the side effects or what the doll can do, and he's brought it into his home, and he wants to further research it, but tells the kids to stay away from it. And Molly and Brittany are creeped out by it, but Ethan thinks it's totally cool because Ethan's a freak. And Brittany's like, this is something that Ethan, of course, would like, right? And Ethan is messing with the dummy, and the dummy ends up, accidentally hitting Brittany, and Ethan makes a joke out of it. And that kind of sours Brittany a little bit, and it's time for them to go, and they bid Molly and her father farewell, and they head back to Brittany's house. Well, while there, Brittany and Ethan are kind of getting into it a little bit. Ethan's making some jokes to her, dropping some breadcrumbs, saying that, he's making some jokes and saying that he's not really saying these things, that the dummy's actually saying it, messing with Brittany. And she starts to kind of think that maybe there might be some truth to what Ethan's saying, but is also questioning it because Ethan has been known to prank her in the past. Well, there's a genuinely funny bit where Brittany and him are fighting, and Ethan's like, well, let me show you my routine. And Ethan's telling some jokes to Brittany, and while she's trying to be mad at him, she just can't help but laugh. And there's some funny clips that he makes his dummy called Mr. Bad Boy say. But also with that cringy things of saying, I'm a bad boy, I'm really a bad boy, stuff like that. And I thought that was kind of lighthearted and kind of funny. And it kind of continues on when they go down to dinner, right? And she keeps having these visions that the dummy is coming alive or animating itself and talking and revealing things to Brittany. and it's freaking her out. And at dinner, the dummy seems to be doing the same thing, but she's chalking it up that Ethan's somehow making the dummy do this. Well, because of the pacing is so bad in this book, it just jumps around points and events. So it's revealed that the next day, since Ethan's going to be staying with them for an undisclosed amount of time, the father has put Ethan into an elementary school, and Brittany's talking with Molly in art class. You know, Brittany's a painter, kind of similar to other dummy characters in the past. And she's talking to Molly. There's some hints being dropped early on about this boy band that she likes. That somehow Mr. Bad Boy, the puppet, is also a fan of, right? And there's some weird, just off-tangent stuff while, you know, Brittany's talking with Molly. You know, they're talking about, like, cell phones and boy bands, and, you know, there's a whole thing with Brittany trying to fake stab her hand randomly with a paintbrush. Really bizarre stuff, but they're talking, and they're mentioning stuff about the Mind Stealer doll. And there was a whole thing that happened that Brittany, you know, touched her head to the glass, and they're kind of bringing this up. And that gets briefly touched on, which carries over into the next part of the story. Well, Brittany comes home, and there's this whole event that happens where... Now, I get kind of confused if this happened before or after, but these kind of happen around the same time. So, she gets a call from her friend, Molly. Her dad has gone out of town, and she's become totally freaked out about this dummy that's going on. Well, not the dummy, but the Mind Stealer doll up in her attic. And she's been talking to a family friend, and they need to get rid of the dummy. Meanwhile, Brittany has had her poster in her room vandalized and a face ripped out of it, right? So all this stuff is building up simultaneously, right? So she goes over to Molly's house to help her get rid of this Mind Stealer doll. And according to legend, you have to bury it inside of a graveyard. So they go there to bury it inside of a graveyard, and that catches up to the first chapter. Apparently this has been going on for 2 whole weeks. This 93-page story, right? Just go along with it. And there's a hand that comes out, but it's revealed to be none other than Ethan, following them and playing pranks. And this upsets Molly, and you know, it kind of carries over in the story where Molly is now starting to put together that it has to be Ethan doing these things. Ethan's the one that's been behind all this. So she goes up to Ethan's room to kind of surprise him and catch him and, you know, say, hey, this is your fault. But the dummy is alive in Ethan's bedroom, and Brittany has a scare and feels like she has to tell her parents, but doesn't know how. And her parents are watching a movie, and she goes downstairs and surprises them. They spill their popcorn. They get upset. And Brittany doesn't know what to do. Nobody's going to believe her. Well, there's an event where Brittany is going to show off her painting to this elderly home that her great aunt is at, and Ethan has been invited by Brittany to join her to do some jokes with Mr. Bad Boy. And they go to this group home, and the great aunt sets all of her friends down, and, you know, Brittany's trying to show them how to paint, and there's some funny dialogue there. And then it comes up to Ethan's turn to show off Mr. Bad Boy, and the jokes get really out of hand, and a big old mess happens with paint, and Brittany's painting gets ruined, her, you know, exhibit painting that she was showing them. And this riles up Brittany and Ethan's relationship. When she gets home, she ends up getting the blame for what Ethan did, and Ethan gets taken to a hockey game while she gets grounded. And she's trying to make contact with Molly, but nobody seems to really be, you know, available to talk. So she gets the bright idea to come up with Molly a plan to show that Ethan is hiding something. So she goes up to Ethan's room, and there's a mess everywhere, right? And they go and find something about this dummy, right? And they decide to go back to Molly's house because Molly has some information in her dad's file since he's away in Australia about these ventriloquists, ventriloquism dummies, in a file folder, and maybe they can find something about a dummy coming to life. Well, they go and look in the file folder and find a file of a dummy named Slappy that looks just like Mr. Bad Boy. And it looks identical. The origin, it said a sorcerer made him in the 1800s with old coffin wood, and he wants to make people his slave. And if you read this incantation, this 6-word incantation, it'll bring him to life and put him to sleep. Which, if you know anything about the dummy books prior to this, if you say the phrase to Slappy or any of the dummies, it doesn't work. It doesn't shut them off. So that's a lie. And it feels like Stein is misremembering his own continuity here. So they go to try it on the dummy, see if it works. And they essentially corner Slappy in his room. And they say, Slappy, we know it's you, the jig is up. And while messing with Slappy, they realize that something might be off after they read the incantation, where they realize his computer in Ethan's room and the dummy has like a voice box in it, and there's a remote, and when you push it, it makes it say certain phrases that Brittany heard throughout the story. So now she is really angry at Ethan because Ethan has set all this up, done all this horrible things with Mr. Bad Boy, aka Slappy, with a voice box. But now that she's read the incantation alive, she goes to bed and she gets woken up by Slappy, and Slappy reveals to her that, hey, since you read the incantation, you're now my slave. And she's like, no, I'm not. And he's like, yes, you are. And I'm going to get you to take me to the Mind Stealer doll that you buried in the graveyard, which Slappy wasn't even there when Ethan went to go to surprise him, but whatever. And Molly's like, well, oh, not Molly, but Brittany's like, well, I'm not going to do that. And Slappy's like, well, if you're not going to, then I'm going to go there myself. So Brittany, realizing the gravity of the situation, tries to follow Slappy so Slappy doesn't end up at the graveyard to take this horrible, who knows what's going to happen with it, Mind Stealer doll. And she ends up cornering him in the graveyard, and Slappy's trying to get to the grave where they buried him, and she's trying to stop him, and a car pulls up, and it ends up being Brittany's parents trying to stop Brittany from, messing with Ethan's dummy. And Slappy says something to her, which causes this whole event to happen. I don't want to spoil. And let's just say something may happen to Slappy in the graveyard. And when it comes time to, go back home with her parents, it's revealed that something may still be there at the graveyard. And that's where the story ends for Revenge of the Living Dummy. So yeah, this story here, it's kind of hard to pull some positives from this, only because the book is just so poorly paced and it's just really all over the place. But if I had a couple of positives, I thought Brittany's monologue was pretty decent. She's not a bad character. I think Brittany got the short end of the stick throughout the whole book. I think she was, fairly written. You can tell that she was trying to make light of a bad situation with her cousin Ethan coming to stay with her, and Ethan being utterly terrible, and not to mention her parents just believing and taking Ethan's side the whole story didn't help her case. But Brittany, she had some personality to her. She had some dynamicism. Not the worst character ever, but she does have some things about her character that are badly written. Like, she does these random things, and I don't know, the way she's written, I haven't mentioned this, but this book came out in 2008, during the digital age where, you have Facebook and texting and, instant message chats all over the place, gossip columns, all that. This book has that element in it with her and Molly, and it's kind of cringe. And not to mention some of the apps they use and some of the websites are just really poorly named knockoffs to avoid copyright issues and trademark issues. It's prevalent throughout this whole book, and it's really cringy. But aside from that, Brittany was a pretty well-written character. Just didn't end up the way I was hoping, you know, with our character, you know, with her potential. But she was fine. Some of the jokes in this book were really funny, and I will give Stein that. Some of the jokes were funny, either from Mr. Bad Boy / Slappy, and some of the stuff that Slappy was involved with throughout the story, which kind of get recontextualized to Ethan's doing, but it was still funny. There's some lighthearted bits that kind of worked and kind of gravitated me in the story, so that helped it. And then the whole approach with the Mind Stealer doll, while it wasn't to the level I was hoping, I do like that angle, having, you know, some other supernatural dolls in the mix here, with maybe more of a sinister origin to it. I was hooked to see if that would ever get revisited, and it technically did, just not to the way I wanted it to, but that did have me in the book a little bit. I'll give it that. But aside from that, I have a lot of negatives to unpack with this. And I've already mentioned the cringe with the digital age references and the poorly named knockoff names of these websites and apps and stuff. That was just bad. And I've already brought up through the plot overview the cringe of I'm a bad boy, I'm a really bad boy, being told ad nauseum from Ethan throughout the story. And it was so bad. And if you read the ending, it kind of plays into that too, and I really have no words. But yeah, just a lot of cringe in this book. Yeah, it's almost as cringy as Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes in a lot of ways. Getting down to the characters, the Molly and her father character aspect I thought was a cool touch, but after this story starts to develop a little bit, or I guess unravel, or just exist, they kind of fall into just bland territory. I was hoping more with Molly's father. It just seemed very plot convenience-ish with Molly's character specifically throughout the story, and that seems to be the purveyor of what ends up happening at the end of the story. And because of that, I take issue with Molly's character, because you have her father setting up this Mind Stealer doll. Father just ups and disappears, and now she just randomly one day needs help to bury it in the graveyard with no backstory of why she needs it. It just happens all of a sudden in the story. And it feels like it's just forcedly put in there to carry the story to the end. And I just take issue with that. And the way the book starts with the first chapter kind of teasing that, why even do that? Like, why? I don't know. And that kind of stems to other things about this book. There's a lot of forced things in here. Whether we're dealing with Ethan, with him turning Slappy into essentially a robot with a voice box, is ludicrous. It's ludicrous, okay? I know the kid has a lot of time on his hands. He's kind of weird, into weird things. But you mean to tell me he came up with this idea to make the dummy seem alive and turn him into a robot and didn't know anything about the origin of Mr. Bad Boy? Where did he get Mr. Bad Boy? That's never even explained. They went through explaining his parents' tumultuous relationship, but did not mention how he got into the hands of Slappy. And when he's up there in Mr. Malloy's attic, he's kind of hinting that he likes the macabre stuff. So wouldn't he know about ventriloquism stuff in the file of Mr. Malloy? Or maybe pertaining to, you know, try to look into that? If he's as smart as he's led on to be in the book? I don't know. It's just, a lot of stuff feels forced here. And that comes down to some forced, you know, relationship building with with her and Ethan. Brittany and Ethan. They totally don't like each other, but Stein keeps trying to force them to have these lighthearted moments. And while I think they're funny because it's forced. And that's the joke. But it's also bad. Because you clearly can tell that these characters are just totally toxic to each other. And you are wondering why Stein is trying to force this in the first place. And that stems down to the characters too. Brittany's parents are purposefully idiots in this story. or at least just mean to their own daughter. When it comes to Ethan, it almost seems like they prefer Ethan over Brittany, and I just don't see any reason why that would be the case. Maybe because they feel sorry for him, but even if that's the case, they treat her like crap in this book for no reason. And Ethan is just a little craphead. I mean, he's just a little weasel kid. Why? This archetype is done a lot in Goosebumps, and we've seen it kind of done with Zane in Dummy 3's book. Lindy and Chris were worse than Ethan, I would say here. But Ethan is just a little toad, and he's not really likable. And all the stuff he does talk about is just really mean things and poorly thought out, humor, unless he has Mr. Bad Boy in his hand. And that's the only time he's funny. I was really despondent to Ethan's character. And, with these character building narratives, I think they could have worked with a longer book. This is only 93 pages for this main story. It's so condensed that there's no real character development of any of these characters because they're just thrown into random sudden situations and recontextualizations. And when I say sudden, I mean sudden because the pacing is atrocious in this book. And that's accompanied, like I said, with the character progression being non-existent because of the pacing. It makes the plotting of the book feel scatterbrained. It's all over the place. It's hard to digest. Even if you want to go back to a book this short to figure out and pinpoint where certain things happen, there's paragraph transitions sometimes within the same paragraph, right? Where you'll go from one setting into a time jump to another time jump within just a few paragraphs. It's just barreling through story with hardly building context, hardly building characters, hardly developing characters, and it's just atrocious. And coming down to the overall climax and ending, the build-up to that, it kind of feels like it's the best part of the book. It's one of those type of things where it feels like the best part of the book, but also one of the more poorly handled parts of the book. The Mind Stealer doll aspect, like I said, is a good thing, but it was forced in the first paragraph. It felt really forced randomly in the book when Molly all of a sudden needs Brittany's help to handle it. And then in the end, Slappy knows apparently that it's at the gravesite, right? But he wasn't there at the graveyard when Ethan came to prank them. So how would he know? He wasn't alive during that point. So how would he know? And it's one of those things, the more you think about it, the less it makes sense. And it's just there for shock value. And even given the point when Brittany's parents show up to the graveyard, apparently following her there, there's a lot of forced things involving the parents there, but that just felt really plot conveniency because it was late at night. How would they know to follow her there? I don't know. In the ending, the last line of the book is just really cringe. And I'll leave it at that. But yeah, this book, I had a lot of negatives. And it's a lot of medium to semi-high hitting ones that just add up. For me, from a 0 to 5 star basis, y'all, I was not a fan of this. I mean, there's more to enjoy, and I think for substantial reasons, compared to some other books I've given in this tier. But for me, I just knew this book, I was on the fence giving it, about a 3 to a 3.1, and that's where I was originally. But the more I thought about it, the more I think this book is a bad book. I just think this is the bad example of a Goosebumps book. If this was your first Goosebumps book, please don't take it like Goosebumps books are always paced this way, plotted this way. Please don't think that. And I want to be shocked if this was your first book and you were disinterested in trying something else from the series. But also inversely, if this was your first book and you didn't know what to expect, I can also see you kind of liking this. That's the only way I can see people actually enjoying this, personally. Now, I could be wrong. Some seasoned readers might actually enjoy this. Good for you, but I can't even bring myself to give this book a meh. Because all the problems added up. I deducted like 2.4 off the top from 5 for all those problems, and ended up giving this book like a 2.6 out of 5, which is a D minus to me. It's a low one. It's almost pushing that. It's on the cusp of being bad or extreme or just terrible. And I just think it's a bad book. I think it has more to offer than some other terrible Goosebumps books that I've read, but it's still not good. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Revenge of the Living Dummy. Let me know down in the comment section if you've read this before. Do you love this or do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.